How's it going, AP Psych class? Welcome to my virtual office, where we will be holding our AP Psychology exam Cram. Rhyming is fun. In this course review, we will go through each AP Psych standard set in place by the College Board in order for us to have an idea of what course content we are comfortable with and what content we might want to revisit. For this review, I'm going to follow the College Board's course and exam description for AP Psych. We will be following the course framework that is supposed to give a detailed description of course requirements that will lead you to success on the AP test. If you would like to take a look at the document, a link can be found in the description box below. Now, huge disclaimer. I do not recommend using this video as your only means of studying for the AP test. While I do plan on touching upon each standard for the class, we are not going to be going into extreme detail. If we did, this video would be several hours long. So what I recommend you do is to go into the description box and click that second link. This will bring you to a checklist of each standard that you can check off as I go through the review. After you finish up with this video, you can go through the checklist and see what items you left blank. You will then find links to my other videos that explain the concepts in more detail. With all that being said, let's get started with Unit 1, the Scientific Foundations of Psychology. The foundations of psychology can be traced all the way to ancient Greece circa 300 BCE, as Greek philosophers such as Aristotle would question the reason behind psychosomatic conditions such as depression or loss of desire. Throughout the years, dozens of notable individuals made several contributions to the field of psychology, such as French philosopher René Descartes theorizing the concept of dualism and Paul Broca's groundbreaking research on the human brain. But it was not until 1879 where German philosopher and physiologist Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany, giving him the title of Father of Experimental Psychology. Wundt took several philosophical ideas and applied the newly created scientific method to them in order to empirically test these theories. Taking ideas from both philosophy and physiology, Wundt was the first individual on record to refer to himself as a psychologist. After Wundt established the first psychology lab, the discipline took off, rapidly gaining popularity in the scientific community. It is important to note, however, that human behavior was still studied prior to the foundation of psychology. In 1841, while teaching Sunday school at an insane asylum, Dorothy Dix noticed the poor treatment of the patients and made it her life goal to improve asylum conditions for those suffering from mental illness. In 1883, G. Stanley Hall, a student of Wundt, brought psychology to the United States, opening the first lab at Johns Hopkins University. 9 years later, he would go on to create the American Psychological Association in 1892. In 1890, William James published Principles of Psychology, where he introduced his psychological school of thought, functionalism. In 1894, Margaret Floyd Washburn would be the first woman to receive her PhD in psychology from Harvard University. In the year 1900, Sigmund Freud would go to publish The Interpretation of Dreams, where he introduces his psychoanalytical perspective of psychology. Across the pond in the States in 1905, psychologist Mary Whiton Culkin made history, becoming the first female president to lead the American Psychological Association. 1 year later, over in Russia, Ivan Pavlov would go to publish his classic study on animal learning, giving us the learning concept of classical conditioning. In 1913, psychologist John B. Watson founded the Behavioral School of Psychology and redefined psychology as the science of behavior. When 1938 came around, cognitive psychologist Jean Piaget would go on to publish his research on how our thinking and thought processes change as we age. Several years later, in 1942, psychologist Carl Rogers revolutionized psychotherapy by introducing his humanistic technique of client-centered therapy. And our little history lesson comes to an end in 1948, where behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner furthered the behavioral approach by theorizing operant conditioning. Today, we have several theoretical approaches in psychology that attempt to explain behavior. Structuralism and functionalism are going to be the first two that we go over. It is important to note that these two approaches have kind of died off over the years, but you still probably want to know them for the AP test. Structuralism was first practiced by Wilhelm Wundt and his student Edward Titchener, and it suggests that the goal of psychology is to study the structure of the mind and consciousness. Functionalism was founded by William James and states that the goal of psychology should not be to study these structures, but to understand the purpose of the mind and consciousness. Gestalt psychology was founded in Germany by a group of psychologists who were not the biggest fans of structuralism. A popular motto of the Gestalt psychologist, "The whole is more than the sum of its parts." Gestalt psychologists emphasize that organisms perceive entire patterns or configurations, not just individual components. The behavioral perspective is going to look into how observable behaviors are acquired or modified through environmental consequences. Behavioral psychologists hold a firm belief that we are the victims of our environment. Based off the workings of Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalytical perspective is going to focus on how our past experiences and unconscious influences influence our behavior. While the psychoanalytical perspective focuses on childhood experiences and the unconscious mind, the humanistic perspective is going to focus on the motivation people have to psychologically grow. Humanists focus on the present and future in dealing with psychological behaviors. The cognitive perspective of psychology is going to focus on the important role of mental processes in how individuals process incoming information, develop language, solve problems, and think. A biological psychologist is going to study the physical basis of human and animal behavior by examining the brain, nervous system, and genetics. A psychologist practicing this perspective believes that all of our behaviors are the result of biological processes occurring within our bodies. An offshoot of the biological approach, we have the evolutionary perspective. Based off the workings of Charles Darwin, the evolutionary perspective is going to apply the principles of natural selection to explain various psychological processes. Psychologists who follow the socio-cultural approach look at how individual behavior is affected specifically by someone's society or culture. It is also important to note that oftentimes psychologists will take an eclectic approach to research, where they draw on multiple disciplines in order to explain behavior. The most common example of an eclectic approach can be seen in the biopsychosocial model, where a researcher examines how biological, social, and psychological factors are going to affect our behavior. Now, this can be a smart move, as each perspective does have its strengths in explaining behavior, which also means that they have their own weaknesses. So picking and choosing between each of the perspective's strengths can be beneficial. On our boards, you will see several different domains of psychology listed. Now, I consider these to be the area of focus that a psychologist decides to dedicate their work to. Each domain is home to psychologists who specialize in various perspectives. A cognitive psychologist and behavioral psychologist can both be therapists. They just take different methods of treatment in explaining and treating abnormal behavior. Moving on now, we have research methods in psychology. Sticking with the scientific method, the first thing we have to do after having our topic of research is to form a hypothesis, which is just going to be our best educated guess of the outcome of our research. Now, we are going to have both descriptive and experimental research methods. Descriptive research is going to involve systematically observing behaviors in order to describe the relationship between behaviors and events. This type of research answers the who, what, when, and where questions. A case study is going to be a research method where one person is studied in depth with the hope of revealing universal principles. Multiple case studies on the brain are the reason for knowing everything we currently know about the brain. Longitudinal studies are when a researcher follows the same group of people for an extended period of time. We are talking several months to many years, and this is all in order to evaluate a change over time in the individual. It's in its name, longitudinal study, should be pretty easy to remember. With the priciness, time commitment, and proneness to losing participants over time, longitudinal studies are not always ideal, which is why we have cross-sectional studies. These are where researchers are going to assess developmental changes by evaluating different age groups of people at the same time. Naturalistic observations are going to involve observing and recording behaviors as they occur in their natural setting. This is done in order to attempt to detect behavior patterns as they already exist in their natural environment. One of the most commonly used descriptive research methods is going to be the survey. Surveys are a cost-efficient and very effective way of obtaining information on attitudes and behaviors. Surveys work by questioning a random sample that represents the target population. Information obtained from surveys and naturalistic observations can show a relationship between two variables. This relationship is referred to as a correlation. Correlations can be positive, where two variables move in the same direction. They can be negative, where two variables move in opposite directions, or there can be no correlation at all. Now, one very, very important thing to note is that correlation does not equal causation. I'm sure you've heard your teacher tell you that. All this means is that the two variables being studied do not have a cause and effect relationship. To prove cause and effect, an experiment must be conducted. Experimental research is a scientific procedure used to demonstrate cause and effect relationships by purposefully manipulating one variable, hoping to produce a change in another variable. When conducting research, specifically behavioral research, psychologists stress the importance of operationally defining variables, which is just when we define our research variables in a way that can be measured. For example, Anxiety could be operationally defined by the score someone receives when taking the Hamilton Anxiety Rating Scale. In experimental research, we have several variables, including the independent, dependent, confounding, and control variables. The independent variable is the variable manipulated by the experimenter that is expected to produce a change in our dependent variable. The dependent variable is just going to be the factor in the experiment that is observed and measured. The control variable is going to be kept constant during the experiment in order to compare with experimental results. A confounding variable is going to be any variable other than the ones being studied that, if we do not control them, could affect the outcomes of our experiment. Confounding variables are bad news. Some examples are going to include the Hawthorne effect and experimenter bias. As mentioned earlier, experiments are designed to prove cause and effect relationships. A typical psychology experiment will have both an experimental and control group. The experimental group includes participants who are exposed to all experimental conditions, while the control group of participants are exposed to all of the same experimental conditions except for the independent variable. The control group will oftentimes use a placebo, which is a fake substance, treatment, or procedure that has no known direct effects. The results of the experimental group can then be compared to the results of the control group. Random assignment is used to make sure that every participant involved in the study has an equal chance of being included in the experimental or control groups. Now, be sure not to get random assignments of participants involved in experimental research confused with random selection of participants, which are mainly used in surveys and correlational studies. As you just saw earlier, each research method has their own set of strengths and weaknesses. So a researcher will choose a method that closely matches their research goal. Choosing the appropriate research method can help with limiting the effect of confounding variables. Statistics also come in handy when dealing with research, in order to properly collect, analyze, and interpret data that we receive. For AP Psychology, what you're going to want to make sure you are familiar with is central tendency or averages. These are things involving the mean, median, and mode. When plotted on a graph, we have a normal distribution when the mean, median, and mode all equal one another. A negative skew is where most of the data leans to the right of the bell curve, and a positive skew is going to be when most of the data leans to the left of the bell curve. The standard of deviation is a statistic that measures the typical distance between the scores of a distribution and the mean. Now take a look at the bell curve on the board. Starting in the middle, when we go one standard of deviation over, it's going to include 68% of the population. With 2 standards of deviation, we have 95% of the population, and within 3 standards of deviation, we have 99.7% of the population. This is more simply referred to as the 68, 95, 99 rule. To calculate the range, you take the highest score minus the lowest score. The bigger the range, the bigger the standard of deviation. There is going to be both descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. Descriptive statistics are numbers that are going to summarize a set of research data obtained from a sample. Central tendency and standards of deviation are included in this data. Descriptive statistics allow us to summarize and graph all of our data. The process involves taking a large amount of data and reducing it to a meaningful summary. Inferential statistics, on the other hand, are statistics that are used to interpret data and draw conclusions. Because of the fact that we are drawing conclusions with these statistics, generally this means that inferential statistics are used during an experiment in an attempt to prove cause and effect. And our last topic of discussion for Unit 1 will be ethical considerations involved in psychological research. Prior to the establishment of these guidelines, there were no real limitations to what a researcher could do. Now, there were some pretty messed up experiments that led to the potential of mental and even physical harm. I'm looking at you, Philip Zimbardo. And as a result, the American Psychology Association, along with several other governing bodies, implemented rules to experimentation. In the simplest of terms, the ethical guidelines are as follow. Do no harm, ensure participation is voluntary, debrief any use of deception, provide results and interpretations to the participants, maintain confidentiality, and to accurately describe risks to potential subjects. Not properly following these guidelines could put a researcher at risk of losing their license to practice. Now under Unit 2, the biological basis of psychology. A very common saying in psychology, everything psychological is biological, meaning that every idea, feeling, and urge we have are met with some type of biological reaction. As a result, The goal of biological psychology is to understand and explain the link between our biology and our behavior. As mentioned previously, included with biological psychology will be Charles Darwin's evolution theory, which will also attempt to explain behavior by analyzing natural selection and how adapted behaviors have evolved over time. Natural selection is a key mechanism in evolution. Organisms that are better adapted to their environment have a better chance of survival, leading to an increase in reproduction. Through reproduction, genetic mutations can occur. Some do nothing, some are bad, and some are good. If the change is beneficial to the organism's survival, there is a higher chance of the trait being passed on. An example with humans is that just recently, and when I say recently, I do mean 5 to 10,000 years ago, natural selection blessed us with the ability to tolerate sugar and lactose in milk. This change leads to more food options, leading to a greater chance of survival, reproduction, and passing along of the trait. So simply put, traits that benefit the organism have a better chance of being passed along. Now, before getting into the nervous system and the brain, I would like to briefly talk about the importance of the endocrine system in regards to behavior. The endocrine system includes our body's glands and regulates the release of hormones. In my opinion, the most important parts of the endocrine system you need to know for the AP test is going to be the pineal gland, pituitary gland, and adrenal gland, all which serve important functions in regulating some of our behaviors, such as our fight or flight response. Now onto the nervous system, which will be our body's primary communication network. The nervous system is going to include subdivisions, the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is going to contain the brain and spinal cord. The brain acts as the command center, while like a telephone line, the spinal cord handles all incoming and outgoing messages. Every thought, action, feeling, and sensation you experience is going to be processed through the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system includes all of our nerve endings lying outside the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system can be broken down into two subdivisions, the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is going to communicate sensory information to the central nervous system while carrying motor messages from the central nervous system to the muscles. The autonomic nervous system regulates all of our involuntary behaviors and can also be broken down into two subdivisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for producing rapid physical arousal in response to perceived threats. More simply put, it controls your fight or flight response, while the parasympathetic nervous system brings our body back to normal in order to conserve physical resources. The most prominent cell in the nervous system is going to be the neuron, which is our body's primary communication cell. The nucleus is going to contain the cell DNA. The cell body or soma provides structural support for the cell. Branching off the cell body, we have the dendrites that receive incoming messages. The long tail of the neuron is referred to as the axon, and it helps send the message to the next neuron. At the tip of our axon, we have the axon terminals, where tiny chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters are stored. And then wrapping around our axon, we have the myelin sheath, which helps speed up neural firing. The myelin sheath is made up of glial cells, which also help in providing support for neurons, as well as removing waste such as dead cells. We are going to have three types of neurons. Sensory or afferent neurons are located throughout the peripheral nervous system and communicate sensory information such as light, sound, pain, and discomfort to the brain. Motor or efferent neurons are responsible for communicating information to the muscles and glands of the body, and the interneuron is going to communicate information between neurons and is by far the most abundant neuron in the human body. Motor and sensory neurons are going to be located in the peripheral nervous system, while interneurons are located in the central nervous system. When a neuron is ready to send a message, an action potential or brief electrical impulse is collected by the dendrites and sent down the axon. Once the impulse reaches the axon terminal, neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic gap where they bind to the next neuron. The neuron that is sending a message is the presynaptic neuron, while the neuron receiving a message is the postsynaptic neuron. Once the message is sent, the neurotransmitters unbind from the postsynaptic receptor site and are reabsorbed into the axon terminals of the presynaptic neuron in a process known as reuptake. Reuptake is a very important concept for biological psychologists to understand, as both psychotropic medications and recreational drug use can interfere with neurofiring. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which is just antidepressant medication, works as an antagonist blocking the reuptake of serotonin, leaving it to flood the synaptic gap in hopes of improving mood. On multiple occasions, I mentioned those tiny brain chemicals called neurotransmitters. Well, in your body, there are over 200 unique neurotransmitters that have been identified, but luckily for us, we only need to know the functions of 7 of them. Acetylcholine stimulates muscle contraction and is also involved in memory, learning, and our general intellectual functioning. Dopamine is going to be involved in movement, attention, learning, and pleasurable sensation. Serotonin involved in sleep, moods, and our emotional states. Norepinephrine is going to increase our heartbeat and physiological arousal, and also deals a little with learning and memory retrieval. Gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, helps calm the brain down in periods of excess neural activity and also helps regulate our daily sleep-wake cycle. Endorphins are going to be involved in pain perception and positive emotions. And glutamate is going to be responsible for prenatal and childhood brain development, but its most important role has to do with learning and memory. A neurotransmitter can be excitatory or inhibitory. Excitatory neurotransmitters speed up brain activity, while inhibitory neurotransmitters slow down brain activity. And our next topic for the biological basis, we are going to take a look at the location and function of various parts of the brain, starting with the hindbrain. The medulla is going to control vital life functions such as breathing and circulation. The pons is going to connect the medulla to the 2 sides of the cerebellum and helps coordinate movements on each side of the body. The cerebellum is going to be responsible for muscle coordination and maintaining posture and equilibrium. The reticular formation is a network of neurons starting at the core of the medulla going all through the brain. Its responsibility is to help regulate our attention and sleep. Next, we have the limbic system, which borders around the brainstem. The term limbic comes from the Latin word limbus, which means border. The hippocampus is a curved brain structure that is involved in learning and the formation of new memories. The hypothalamus is going to regulate behavior related to survival, such as eating, drinking, and sexual activity. The thalamus is going to process sensory information for every sense except for the sense of smell before reaching the cerebral cortex. And the amygdala is a primitive area of the brain involved in memory and emotional responses, especially those related to fear and aggression. Now moving on to the midbrain, we are just going to focus on one structure, the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is going to play an important role in our reward system and movement, as it is the center of dopamine production. Next up, we have the forebrain, which will include our cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is separated into the left and right hemispheres of the brain, and it contains our brain's lobes. The corpus callosum is a bundle of neurons that connect the left and right hemispheres, allowing them to communicate with one another. The frontal lobe is going to process voluntary muscle movements and is involved in thinking, planning, and emotional control. The parietal lobe processes our somatic sensations such as temperature or touch. The temporal lobe's primary function is to process auditory information, and the occipital lobe will process our visual information. Within our lobes, we have cortical areas, which are specialized brain regions in the cerebral cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for a variety of complex behaviors and greatly contributes to personality development. The primary motor cortex is responsible for the production of skilled movement, specifically face and hand movements. The somatosensory cortex is going to receive and process sensory information from the entire body. Wernicke's area is going to help us comprehend speech, while Broca's area is going to help us produce speech. The development of brain scans gave researchers the ability to observe and map out the brain and see how our brain reacts to various stimuli. From sleep studies to explaining the cause of various mental illnesses, the invention and advancement of brain scans have given us a plethora of information on the brain. Prior to the development of brain scans, brain research was often done through long case studies and examining a physical brain through autopsies. During the 1950s and 60s, Roger Sperry conducted what is known as the split brain procedure, where he would have a patient's corpus callosum cut, severing the connection between the left and right brain hemispheres. Sperry's research earned him a Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for his discovery concerning the functional specialization of cerebral hemispheres. Continuous research has also shown us just how adaptable our brains are. Brain scans have even shown that after the brain receives any form of traumatic injury, it has the ability to move brain functions from damaged areas to other undamaged areas. This is actually a process discovered by Polish neuroscientist Jerzy Konorski, called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity can be functional, where, as I just mentioned, functions from damaged areas of the brain move to undamaged ones, or it can be structural, where the brain's physical structure actually changes as a result of learning. The level of brain activity present in an individual also relates to the state of consciousness they are currently in. Consciousness is just going to be our awareness of ourselves and our environments. Advancements in neuroscience in the 1960s made it possible to relate brain activity to various mental states, such as waking, sleeping, and dreaming. Researchers even started to look at the effect that things like hypnosis and psychoactive drugs have on our consciousness. Psychoactive drugs can be placed into three basic categories: depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens. Depressants are drugs such as alcohol and opiates that work to reduce neural activity and slow down bodily functions. Stimulants are going to do the opposite by exciting neural activity and speeding up body functions. Mild stimulants include caffeine and nicotine, while more powerful stimulants are substances such as methamphetamines and cocaine. Drugs such as LSD and cannabis are classified as hallucinogens, causing distorted perceptions and invoke sensory images in the absence of any sensory input. Simply put, seeing things that are not there. Recreational drug use and abuse can lead to negative behavior changes, as continued drug use can lead to both physical and psychological dependency. When someone is dependent on a drug and discontinues using that drug, it can lead to physical distress and discomfort in what is known as withdrawal. Father of American psychology, William James, coined the term stream of consciousness, which includes our full range of thoughts that we can be aware of at any given time. Sigmund Freud is going to dive even deeper into consciousness, separating it into three levels: the conscious, the unconscious, and the preconscious. And for our last topic of discussion for Unit 2, we have sleep and dreams. Starting off with why we sleep, we are going to take a look at two theories. The restorative theory explains the physiological need for sleep, stating that the function of sleep is to repair and restore the brain and body, while the adaptive theory states that the reason we sleep at night is an evolutionary adaptation that serves to keep us out of harm's way when we would be more vulnerable to dangers. Deep in the hypothalamus resides a cluster of neurons known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is responsible for regulating our circadian rhythm. During the onset of sleep, the endocrine system also helps out by releasing the sleep hormone melatonin. Psychologists are going to divide sleep into two categories: NREM and REM. NREM sleep contains three stages, which are characterized by our level of brain activity. Next, we have our deepest stage of sleep, REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement, which makes sense because when we are in this stage of sleep, our eyes appear to be darting back and forth. During REM sleep, the brain is very active, and at this stage, we see dreams occur. One sleep cycle lasts roughly 90 minutes, and in order to get a healthy night's rest, we should be going through about 6 or 8 of these cycles. Lack of sleep, specifically REM sleep, can lead to sleep deprivation, which has several negative psychological and physiological effects. Not always, but oftentimes, sleep deprivation is a result of some form of sleep disorder. Whether it be insomnia or sleep apnea, a common theme amongst sleep disorders is that they obviously interfere with your sleep cycle, causing distress in your day-to-day life. And last, let's take a look at our theories on dreaming. While there are many, we're going to focus on two of the major ones. The activation synthesis theory is going to state that biological processes in the brain lead to our dreams. The theory states that during sleep, our limbic systems become more active. As the brain synthesizes and interprets this activity, it attempts to create a meaning out of it, and as a result, we have our dreams. Sigmund Freud considered dreams to be the royal road to the unconscious mind, stating that while we sleep, our ego's defenses are lowered and repressed material come through to awareness in a distorted form, known as our dreams. Unit 2, check. Now on to Unit 3, sensation and perception. So our brain does an amazing job at organizing and integrating sensory information. Our ability to perceive patterns, depth, and movement are all the results of our brain taking in raw sensory data and making sense of it. Sensation is going to be the process of detecting a physical stimulus such as light, sound, heat, or pressure, while perception is going to integrate, organize, and interpret this information picked up by our sensory receptors. When a physical stimulus is picked up by a sensory receptor site, it goes through an act known as transduction, where the stimulus is converted into a neural impulse that can be read and understood by the brain. There are going to be several principles that guide our sensation. We're going to start with the absolute threshold. The absolute threshold is the minimum level of stimulation needed to detect a stimulus 50% of the time. Stimuli outside of our absolute threshold can be consciously detected, while stimuli inside of our absolute threshold cannot be. The absolute threshold will only apply when we are working with one stimulus. To measure a change in multiple stimuli, we use the difference threshold. aka the just noticeable difference, which is going to be the smallest possible difference between two stimuli that can be detected half the time. Selective attention is when we focus our conscious awareness on a particular stimulus, all the while excluding others. This allows us to function in a world where sensory information is constantly being exposed to us. Sensory adaptation is going to be a decreased responsiveness to stimuli due to constant sensory stimulation. The signal detection theory states that the detection of a stimulus depends on both the intensity of the stimulus as well as the physical and psychological state of the individual. And the cocktail party effect is our brain's ability to focus our attention on a particular stimulus while filtering out a wide range of other stimuli. Think of trying to have a conversation with your friend during a loud concert or event. So we have several prominent individuals to thank for everything we know about how our sensation and perception work, starting with Gustav Fechner, who established a new branch of psychology known as psychophysics. During my boy Gustav's research with Ernst Weber, the two established the Weber-Fechner law, or just Weber's law, which is going to help explain the difference threshold. Psychologists David Hubble and Torsten Wiesel recorded electrical activity from individual neurons in cats and found that specific neurons react to certain stimuli and not to others, teaching us about the body's visual system. Now let's take a look at some of our principles of perception. So after all of this raw sensory information is received by the brain, the next step is for the brain to make sense of it. Bottom-up processing is information processing that emphasizes the importance of sensory receptors in detecting the basic features of a stimulus. On the reverse end, top-down processing is information processing that emphasizes the importance of the observer's prior knowledge, expectations, and other cognitive functions in arriving at meaningful perceptions. Bottom-up processing will be data-driven, while top-down processing is conceptually driven. A perceptual set is going to refer to our predisposition to perceive things in a certain way. So when you observe this picture, what do you first see? A rabbit or a duck? Our perceptual sets will be determined by our schemas, which are just going to be our mental structures that we use to organize information. Schemas can be used to explain why someone thinks they see a UFO in the sky, or Bigfoot in a blurry picture with a total of 12 pixels. The context effect describes the influence of environmental factors on one's perception of a stimulus. Now earlier I mentioned a school of psychological thought known as Gestalt Psychology. Gestalt Psychology is also going to help us with perception as it describes how we as humans group similar elements, recognize patterns, and simplify complex images when we perceive objects. One of the important aspects of Gestalt psychology is the idea of the figure-ground relationship. Gestalt psychologists observe that we see objects as distinct from their surroundings. The figure is the dominant object, while the ground is a natural and formless setting for the figure. Depth perception is going to be our ability to judge the distance and movements of objects. Both monocular and binocular cues allow us to perceive depth. Monocular cues are just any way that a single eye helps us see and process what we are looking at. Just think of a monocle, which is just one of those old-time glasses that only cover up one of our eyes. A binocular cue, on the other hand, is going to require the use of retinal images from both of our eyes to allow us to perceive depth. Retinal disparity is a binocular cue that states the greater the difference between two retinal images, the closer the object is to the viewer. Convergence is another binocular cue that looks at the extent to which our eyes converge or turn inward when looking at an object, specifically those that are close to us. Now remember, depth perception doesn't only deal with distance, but also movement. Perceptual constancies refer to our ability to perceive objects as unchanging, even as light and retinal images change. Thanks to size constancy, we perceive the form of familiar objects as constant, even if the object is providing a smaller retinal image due to its distance. A car in the horizon will start to produce a larger retinal image as it gets closer to you. Your brain is able to tell you that this car isn't just changing its size, it's just getting closer and closer. Shape constancy is going to have the same concept, but with the shape of an object. When someone opens a door, the retinal image changes, but we still perceive the door as a rectangle and unchanging. So now that we have all these concepts, theories, and principles of sensation and perception down, we are going to move on to the anatomy of our senses. Starting with vision. Light waves from the environment are gathered by the cornea. The iris is going to be responsible for how much light enters as it controls the diameter of the pupil. Passing through the lens, the light waves are then focused and projected onto the retina. In the retina, we have our sensory receptors for vision, our rods and cones. Ganglion and bipolar cells are also present in the retina. Sensory information is funneled into the ganglion cells, where it is then collected by the bipolar cells and sent to the appropriate rod or cone. This visual information is then transduced into a neural message and sent to the optic nerve, which leads the message to the brain. There are going to be two major theories that attempt to explain how we perceive color. The trichromatic theory states that humans perceive color because of the presence of three varieties of cones that are sensitive to different wavelengths. The wavelengths being blue, green, and red. The combination of these three cones allow for overlapping, allowing us to perceive all of the colors that we can. The opponent process theory states that opposing pairs of color receptors enable us to perceive vision. Today, the understanding we have on how we process color takes ideas from both theories, stating that the retina's red, green, and blue cones respond in varying degrees to different colors. Then the neurons are processed by opponent process cells while making their way to the occipital lobe. Disorders associated with our vision include colorblindness, farsightedness, nearsightedness, macular degeneration, cortical blindness, and prosopagnosia. Synesthesia, while not necessarily a disorder, is a neurological condition where stimulation of one sensory pathway leads to an automatic involuntary experience in a second sense. So you might do things like see sounds or hear colors. While synesthesia can affect any of the senses, it is important to note that it usually involves sight. Now, before I leave vision, I do want to revisit top-down processing because this type of processing can lead us to perceive certain visual stimuli in their incorrect form. This helps explain why we may think we see a face on the surface of Mars. The next sense we talk about is going to be hearing. The anatomy of the ear can be divided into three sections. Sound waves first are collected by the outer ear, where it travels through our ear canal until it makes contact with our eardrum. The sound waves are going to cause the eardrum to vibrate up against three tiny bones located in the middle ear, known as our auditory ossicles. These ossicles then amplify the sound waves and send them to the cochlea. And within the cochlea, we have the basilar membrane, where the sensory receptors for hearing, the hair cells, are located. When receiving the sound waves, the hair cells transduce them into a neural message and send them to the auditory nerve, with its final destination being the temporal lobe. Just like sight, there are going to be two major theories for how we perceive sound. The frequency theory states that the basilar membrane will vibrate at the same frequency as the incoming sound waves. However, individual neurons only have a firing capacity of about 1,000 times per second. So how do we perceive sounds above 1,000 hertz? The place theory is going to hold the view that different frequencies cause larger vibrations at different locations along the basilar membrane. Sensory disorders involving our hearing are going to include conductive, sensorineural, and mixed hearing loss. The next two senses we talk about are going to be our body's chemical senses of taste and smell. For smell or olfaction, there are no basic sensations. Instead, we have roughly 5 million olfactory receptor cells with over 1,000 different receptor proteins that are able to recognize a variety of smells. When transduced into a neural message, smell will be our only sense that bypasses the thalamus and heads directly to its final location, the olfactory bulb. For taste or gustation, food chemicals enter our mouth and are processed by the taste buds located on the tongue, mouth, and throat. The major tastes that we as humans can perceive are going to be sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. Gotta love umami. Once the neural message is transduced, it is sent through the thalamus to the gustatory cortex. And real quick, never use a tongue map to explain how we perceive taste. It's not right. And time to finish off our talk on senses by discussing the body senses. Our sense of touch is going to include multiple sensations. We are going to have pressure, warmth, pain, and cold, which can be combined with one another in order for us to perceive the variety of bodily senses we do. Nociceptors are found in the skin, muscles, and internal organs, and hold the responsibility for transducing bodily sensations into neural messages that the brain can understand. One theory of bodily sensation that is important to know is going to be the gate control theory of pain, which basically states that the nerve fibers in our spinal cord either open or close in order to regulate the level of pain that the brain receives. The 5 senses we just discussed are considered the major bodily senses. However, there are other systems in the body that help us pick up on incoming sensory stimuli. Our kinesthetic sense allows us to be aware of where our body parts are in proportion to one another. Proprioceptors in the muscles and joints take in incoming sensory information, transduce the raw sensory data, and send them to the brain. And because of that, you're able to grab a cup of coffee off your desk, bring it to your mouth without even looking at it. The vestibular sense controls our body movement and positioning, allowing us to maintain proper balance. Vestibular sacs located in the semicircular canal of the ear respond to gravity in order to encode information about the head's orientation. Unit 3 done, and now on to Unit 4, learning. Quick disclaimer, I'm not the biggest fan of how Unit 4 learning standards are organized in the College Board CED, so I am going to be going a little out of order here for this unit. Also, Learning Target 4A asks us to identify key contributors in the field of learning. Well, we will be talking about all of these guys' contributions as we are talking about the different learning concepts, so it is going to be a little out of order. I apologize if this confuses you a bit, but I do think it makes the information flow a little bit more smoothly. So in psychology, learning is going to be any semi-permanent change in behavior that is brought on by experience or practice. In the 1890s, Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov discovered the process of classical conditioning while studying the digestive tracts of dogs. Pavlov would give a dog some food, and the dog would start to drool. Makes sense, right? Well, eventually the dogs would start to drool before seeing the food, but from hearing the footsteps of Pavlov's assistants bringing in the food. The dogs were able to make an association between the footsteps and the food, causing them to drool from the footsteps alone. Classical conditioning is the basic learning process that is going to involve repeatedly pairing a neutral stimulus with a response-producing stimulus to make the neutral stimulus produce the same response. Later on, in 1919, behavioral psychologist John B. Watson furthered Pavlov's research on classical conditioning by attempting to create a fear response in a baby who was referred to as Little Albert. Using the principles of classical conditioning, Watson created a fear response in Little Albert by smashing a metal object and creating a loud noise while the baby was looking at something it liked. In this case, a white rat. Little Albert eventually associated the loud noise with the rat and learned to fear the rat. The AP test is going to require that you are able to identify the various components of classical conditioning, so that will be our next topic. Acquisition is going to be the first stage of learning, and this is just when a response to a specific stimulus is established. Before learning occurs, we have our unconditioned stimulus and our unconditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus, or UCS, is any stimulus that will naturally and reflexively trigger a response without prior learning or practice. The response elicited by the unconditioned stimulus is called the unconditioned response. In the case of Little Albert, the unconditioned stimulus would be the loud noise Watson made, while the unconditioned response is Little Albert crying. Loud noises naturally scare babies, so it makes sense that Little Albert starts to cry. After continuously exposing Little Albert to this combination of loud, scary noise and cute, fuzzy rat, learning starts to occur. The conditioned stimulus, or CS, is a previously neutral stimulus that, after becoming associated with the unconditioned stimulus, will eventually trigger a learned conditioned response. With the Little Albert case, our previously neutral, now conditioned stimulus is the rat, with our conditioned response being Little Albert crying. Watson also observed that during the experiment, Little Albert's fear response was generalized rather than discriminated, as Albert had a fear response to not only rats, but all white fuzzy things. Now remember, I stated that learning was only a semi-permanent change in behavior. So what's going to happen over time when Watson no longer pairs the unconditioned stimulus or loud noise with the conditioned stimulus of a white rat? The conditioned response starts to weaken and we start to see extinction occur, where the conditioned response begins to weaken and eventually fade away. However, Little Albert is not out of the water yet because oftentimes we see the sudden reappearance of a previously extinct conditioned response in a phenomenon known as spontaneous recovery. As part of classical conditioning, we also have what is known as higher order conditioning, which is another observation made by Ivan Pavlov during his dog research. Higher order conditioning refers to a situation where a neutral stimulus is paired with an already conditioned stimulus in order to produce the same conditioned response. So how this works. Pavlov pairs an unconditioned stimulus of food with a neutral stimulus of a bell. Once conditioned, Pavlov then pairs another neutral stimulus, such as light, with the now conditioned stimulus of the bell. And eventually, the dogs will start to salivate from the light alone, kind of like classical conditioning inception. As a strict behaviorist, John Watson believed that psychologists should focus on only observable behaviors. Watson did not believe any type of cognition should be used to explain this phenomenon. However, modern psychologists view classical conditioning a bit different than how Pavlov and Watson viewed it. Psychologist Robert Rescorla was one of the first psychologists to study the cognitive aspects of classical conditioning while studying some rats. Rescorla found that when being exposed to various stimuli, we actively attempt to process information about the reliability of the signals we encounter. Psychologist John Garcia is going to disagree with Pavlov's notion that for conditioning to occur, the neutral stimulus must be presented immediately or very shortly after the unconditioned stimulus. In his research, Garcia would let rats drink flavored water and would shortly after expose them to enough radiation to become ill. Even though it was not the flavored water that made the rats sick, after recovering from the illness, they refused to drink any more of it, even though the internal aversive feeling came hours after drinking the water and being exposed to the radiation. This is what is known as taste aversion. And as you can see, it goes against traditional Pavlovian conditioning, as the conditioning did not require repeated pairings, and the time span between the two stimuli were several hours and not mere seconds. The reason for this discrepancy is because of something called a biological predisposition, which is when an organism is predisposed to form associations between certain stimuli and responses. Now on to our next topic, operant conditioning. In 1898, psychologist Edward Thorndike coined the term law of effect, which is a psychology principle that suggests that when satisfaction follows an association, a behavior is more likely to be repeated, while if it follows an unfavorable outcome, then it'll be less likely to be repeated. Thorndike's work inspired behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner to research a new form of conditioning known as operant conditioning back in 1937. Operant conditioning is a method of learning in which behaviors are either strengthened or weakened as a result of reinforcement or punishment. With operant conditioning, there are 4 possible consequences to a behavior. Reinforcement is going to be any consequence that increases the likelihood of a behavior repeating itself. Reinforcement will always be a good thing. Reinforcement literally means to strengthen. That's good. So when you are wondering if something is an example of reinforcement, ask yourself, is the consequence of the organism's actions strengthening the behavior? If yes, then you know it's reinforcement. Punishment, on the other hand, will be a consequence that decreases the likelihood of a behavior repeating itself. Makes sense, right? Usually when you're punished, it's because you did something you weren't supposed to do. Now, here's where things start to get a little tricky. Both punishment and reinforcement can be either positive or negative. Positive reinforcement is going to work by strengthening a response by presenting a rewarding stimulus after the response. You do your chores at home, your parents give you $5. Negative reinforcement, still reinforcement, will strengthen a response by taking away an aversive or unwanted stimulus after the response. So, you do your chores at home, and your parents tell you, all right, you don't have to do the dishes for the next month. Positive punishment will weaken a response by adding an aversive stimulus as a consequence to a response. So you do bad on a test, your teacher gives you extra homework. And negative punishment will refer to a situation in which a rewarding or reinforcing stimulus is taken away as a consequence of a behavior in order to weaken the response. Let's say you're talking while the teacher's talking, so they decide to take your cell phone away. We are going to see that reinforcement can be continuous when every occurrence of a particular response is followed by reinforcement, or it can be partial, and this is just going to be when a particular response is only reinforced just some of the time. Just like classical conditioning, extinction also exists in operant conditioning, and these reinforcement schedules help reduce the impact of extinction. Our first reinforcement schedule is going to be the fixed ratio schedule, which is just when reinforcement is given after a set number of responses. So every 6th visit to the sandwich shop, your 7th sandwich is free. Next, we have the variable ratio, which is just going to be reinforcement that occurs after a random number of responses. So a gambler on the slot machine is reinforced every time they win, but they are unaware of when they're going to win. A fixed interval schedule is going to deliver reinforcement after a set amount of time. So every 2 minutes when a rat pushes a button, food comes out. And a variable interval schedule will be when reinforcement is delivered for the first response that occurs after a random time interval. So a rat who's on a variable interval schedule may be rewarded after 20 seconds, then after 15 seconds, then after 50 seconds. The time is unpredictable. The rat just has to do that action after that time has passed. According to psychologists, the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement is going to be the most resistant to extinction, which can be shown in the graph on the board. Much like classical conditioning, today, psychologists have a different view on the components of operant conditioning, specifically biological and cognitive components. Psychologist Martin Seligman found that when an organism is repeatedly subjected to an aversive stimulus that it cannot escape, it'll eventually stop trying to avoid the stimulus in an act known as learned helplessness. Psychologists have also noted that there is a tendency for an organism to revert to an unconscious automatic behavior that interferes with a learned behavior in what is known as instinctive drift. No matter how well you think you trained a pet tiger, probably not a good idea to keep one as a pet for this reason alone. And now on to our final topic of learning, which is going to be observational learning, as well as a few types of cognitive learning. Edward Tolman observed that sometimes learning is not immediately expressed. Tolman noticed that when rats had time to explore a maze with no reinforcer offered, they still created a mental map of the maze. learning to pass even though no reinforcement or observable actions were present. While working with Sultan the chimp, Wolfgang Kohler observed that learning can sometimes happen out of nowhere. Insight learning is the sudden realization of the solution to any problem without repeated trials or continuous practice. In 1961, prominent cognitive psychologist Albert Bandura carried out his famous Bobo the Doll experiment. Data from this experiment provided him with the basis for his social cognitive theory of observational learning. This theory is going to go directly against the behavioral approach of learning. Bandura simply believed that learning could occur through observation, and no observable behaviors had to be present. It is important to differentiate between classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. Remember, conditioning is a behavioral approach to explaining behavior. It depends on observable behaviors expressed by an organism, while observational learning is going to include the act of modeling and mirror neurons in order to learn new behaviors. Remember, operant conditioning is going to deal with our active, voluntary behaviors, while classical conditioning will involve involuntary processes. Next, we will discuss the social and cognitive factors in learning. Knowing what we do about how learning occurs, both through cognitive and behavioral means, has given us the ability to help treat maladaptive learned behaviors. Behavior modification uses the principles of conditioning to help people develop more effective or adaptive behaviors. Alright, next up we have Unit 5, Cognitive Psychology. Starting with defining cognition, cognition is just going to be any mental activity associated with thinking, knowing, and remembering. In this unit, we will talk about our memory and thinking processes. Whether we are making connections in order to learn or simply repeating material to ourselves, we are going to see that there are several cognitive acts that we do on a daily basis in order to just get through the day. We will start our Unit 5 review with memory. One of the most popular ways to explain how our memory functions is through the Atkinson-Schriffen stage model of memory. Environmental information is first picked up by our sensory memory. Our sensory memory can hold a large amount of information, but only for about a third of a second to 3 seconds. While your sensory memory contains information registered from all the senses, the majority of it is filled with the iconic information from our sight and the echoic information from our hearing. When paying attention to a certain stimulus, it will move over to our next stage of memory, our short-term memory. Our short-term memory is a relatively brief storage system that's going to contain information that we are consciously aware of. In 1956, psychologist George Miller published his work on short-term memory, finding that the capacity for our short-term memory is going to be 7 plus or minus 2 items, or just anywhere from 5 to 9 units of information. This can be increased if information is chunked together. The duration for our short-term memory is about 20 seconds unless the information is rehearsed. Technically, any memory stored for longer than 20 seconds is going to be considered a long-term memory. Long-term memory is the relatively permanent and limitless storehouse of the memory systems. Long-term memories are either declarative or non-declarative. Declarative memories are memories we are consciously aware of, such as episodic or semantic memories. While non-declarative memories are things we are not consciously aware of, these are going to include our procedural memories. For a memory to move from our short-term memory to our long-term memory, a process known as encoding must occur. Encoding is the process of moving information into the memory systems. Shallow processing or maintenance rehearsal involves the simple repetition of whatever you're trying to remember, while deep processing or elaborative rehearsal is a form of encoding where associations are formed between new information and information already stored in our memory. According to psychologists, elaborative rehearsal is a more effective way of encoding information. Processing of information can be effortful or automatic. When encoding requires attention and some degree of conscious effort, we consider it effortful, and when encoding involves little to no mental resources, it is referred to as automatic. So when you first start to drive, you're consciously aware of several things, such as the orientation of the steering wheel or how much pressure you're putting on the pedal. You're going to be consciously processing all of this information, but as you continue to drive, your muscle memory improves and it starts to require less and less conscious awareness, making it more of an automatic behavior. Once information is encoded into our long-term memory, it then must be stored. Storage is going to refer to the retention of encoding information over time. In our long-term memory, information is generally going to be clustered into related groups. According to the semantic network model, information in our long-term memory is organized in a complex network of associations. Retrieval is going to refer to the process of recovering information stored in our long-term memory in order to make ourselves consciously aware of it. Part of retrieval, recall, is going to refer to retrieving information without the aid of any retrieval cues, while recognition is our ability to recognize previously encountered events, objects, or people. Our retrieval of information is often tested through the serial position effect and the encoding specificity principles. Next up for memory, we have forgetting and memory distortion. In 1873, psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus wanted to experiment with forgetting to see how much information was forgotten after different lengths of time. In doing so, we have the famous Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Forgetting is just going to refer to our inability to recall information that was previously available. Psychologists have several explanations as to why we forget, and we are going to go over some of the major ones. Encoding failure occurs when we are unable to recall specific information because of insufficient encoding of the information for storage in long-term memory. The decay theory is a biological explanation for why we forget, stating that forgetting is a normal metabolic process that occurs to our memories over time if they are not refreshed. Proactive interference is when previously learned information hinders our ability to retrieve newly learned information, while retroactive interference is when newly formed memories interfere with previously learned information. Motivated forgetting occurs when a memory has a negative feeling associated with it, so we do our best to forget about it. We have two types of motivated forgetting, suppression and repression. Suppression is motivated forgetting at a conscious level, while repression is motivated forgetting that occurs at an unconscious level. Forgetting is not going to be the only issue when it comes to our memory. We are also going to learn that our memories are not going to be a perfect recreation of events, a topic that cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus focused her research on. A false memory is a recollection of information that seems real in your mind, but might have some inaccuracies. Elizabeth Loftus has organized several experiments to test this phenomenon and theorized several explanations for their occurrence. The misinformation effect is when your existing memories are altered if you were exposed to misleading information. This can often be explained by source confusion, which occurs when the true source of a memory is forgotten. Through her research, Loftus also found that memories can also be altered by our imagination. Imagination inflation is when vividly imagining an event increases the confidence that the event actually took place. Schema distortion also tends to lead to false or imperfect memories, as we have the tendency to fill in blanks with information that is consistent with existing knowledge of the topic. And for our last topic for memory, we have its biological basis. The hippocampus is responsible for encoding information from our short-term to our long-term. The amygdala is also going to play a role in memory, encoding the emotional aspects of some of our memories. While the cerebellum will be responsible for our memories involving movement, memory disorders such as amnesia are often the result to damage to one of these brain regions. Alright, so now onto the cognitive processes of thinking and problem solving. Psychologists have identified several cognitive processes that we go through when working through a problem. Sometimes we use trial and error, attempting several possible solutions in order to find the one that works, or other times we follow an algorithm where we stick to a set of specific rules and procedures that always give us the correct answer if followed properly. Oftentimes, we'll even use a rule of thumb strategy known as heuristic in order for us to make judgments and solve problems more efficiently. While effective in cutting down the time to solve problems, it is more prone to error than algorithms. Heuristics are also going to be prevalent when we're making decisions. A representative heuristic is when we judge the likelihood of things in terms of how well they seem to represent a particular prototype, while the availability heuristic is when we estimate the likelihood of events based on the available information that we have. Oftentimes, the solution to a problem even comes out of nowhere, and this is what Wolfgang Kohler refers to as insight, which is just the sudden realization of a solution to a problem. These are your aha moments. Problem solving does involve a level of creativity, so this is another concept that psychologists measure. Creativity is our ability to think about a problem or idea in a new and unusual way. Convergent thinking involves using problem-solving strategies directed toward one correct solution, while divergent thinking, a more creative form of thinking, is going to involve producing many answers to the same question. As you probably know, problem solving is not a foolproof process, and oftentimes we face obstacles while dealing with a problem. Confirmation bias is our tendency to seek out evidence that confirms our existing beliefs while ignoring evidence that might contradict it. When we fixate on an issue, we are unable to see the problem from a new perspective, which can definitely lead to some troubles with problem solving. Then we have a mental set, which is our tendency to approach a problem in a particular way, especially a way that has been successful in the past. This can be used as heuristic, but it can also cause us to fixate on something that has nothing to do with the solution. Go-to example being, have you tried turning it off and on again? Functional fixedness is our tendency to only view problems in their customary manner. Overcoming functional fixedness broadens our ability to solve problems, giving us more of a variety to our solution. Something I have a lot of. Overconfidence is just going to be our tendency to allow how confident we are in our own ability to hinder our problem solving. And framing is a cognitive bias where people decide on options based on how the opinions are presented to them. So if you had to choose between a medicine with a 98% success rate or a 2% failure rate, which one would you go with? Alright, so that does it with problem solving. And now that that's out of the way, we can move on to another thing I have a lot of: intelligence. Intelligence is just going to refer to our global capacity to think rationally, to act purposefully, and to deal effectively with our environment. Psychologists consider several factors while attempting to measure intelligence. Abstract versus verbal measures just refers to the fact that IQ tests contain a diverse mixture of questions that are going to try to tap into our abstract reasoning skills. The purpose of an IQ test is to measure intellectual potential rather than factual knowledge. Another factor is going to be speed of processing. This is just going to refer to how our raw mental speed is going to be linked with intelligence. This just leads to the assumption that faster is going to be smarter. If me and you both take an IQ test, and you take 10 minutes and I take an hour, is it fair for us to receive the same score? Psychologists also categorize intelligence into fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is going to be our ability to reason and think flexibly, while crystallized intelligence refers to our accumulation of knowledge and skills throughout our entire lifetime. While fluid intelligence does tend to decline as we age, research has shown that crystallized intelligence continues to increase through our adult lives. Throughout the 20th century, psychologists observed a steady rise of both crystallized and fluid intelligence, which researchers have credited to better health, nutrition, and the rising standards of living. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as the Flynn effect. However, psychologists also observed that the stereotype threat, which is just going to be a situational issue where people feel the need to conform to stereotypes about their social groups, might negatively affect how we measure intelligence a bit. Studies on the stereotype threat have shown that negative stereotypes about a specific group, whether it be race or gender, can raise inhibiting doubts and high-pressure anxieties in the test taker's mind, leading to a decreased performance on the intelligence test. So in reality, the test results don't reflect their true intelligence. We also do see that while IQ tests attempt to be culturally biased, they often end up failing to do so. Several studies have actually shown that IQ scores of a majority group are on average higher than most of those in minority groups. This does not necessarily reflect actual intelligence, just cultural bias in testing. Next, we're going to take a look at 3 prominent individuals and their theory on the nature of intelligence. Charles Spearman theorized general intelligence, which he called the G factor. Spearman states that we have a general intelligence factor that is responsible for our overall performance on a test of mental ability. Meaning, if we score well in one area, we will score well in others. And vice versa for if we score poorly. Howard Gardner is going to attempt to stretch the definition of intelligence, observing the skills and products that are valued in different cultures, rather than a general intelligence score. Gardner's test is going to measure different learning styles, such as bodily kinesthetic or interpersonal. Gardner's theory was very popular in the field of education, but it's recently come under extreme criticism due to the broad definition of intelligence, stating that his 8 separate intelligences only represent talents, not actual intelligence. Our last theorist is going to be Robert Sternberg and his triarchic theory of intelligence, which will focus on 3 areas of intelligence: our analytical intelligence, our creative intelligence, and our practical intelligence, which is also referred to as street smarts. Alright, so now for a brief history lesson on the history of intelligence testing. Francis Galton is going to be one of the first people to study intelligence in the 1800s. He based it on reaction time. I don't know why. Galton basically set up a bunch of different experiments testing reaction time and other physical and sensory qualities, and basically just correlated those with intelligence. French psychologist Alfred Binet was the first to create an actual intelligence test that measured different mental abilities. Results of the test gave the test taker a mental age. Your mental age is just going to be your mental level expressed in terms of the average abilities of a given age group. So if a 10-year-old takes the test and scores like your average 15-year-old, that 10-year-old would have a mental age of 15. American psychologist and Stanford professor Louis Terman worked off of Binet's test to create the Stanford-Binet intelligence test. Terman's test was the first to utilize the IQ score. IQ was just calculated by comparing an individual score with the scores of others in the same age group. Not satisfied with the Stanford-Binet test, psychologist David Wechsler devised a test of his own known as the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS. Weschler believed that intelligence should be measured through different mental abilities. In his research, Weschler found some cases where an individual with a developmental conditions excel at specific things or talents. Psychologists categorize tests as either achievement or aptitude tests. Achievement tests are going to measure your knowledge on a specific topic or skill. These are things like an AP Psychology test or an AP History test, while an aptitude test is going to be designed to assess a person's capacity to benefit from education or training. These tests are attempting to predict your ability to learn. These are tests such as IQ tests or the SATs. And I guess I don't want to leave out the inferior ACTs, so I'll throw those in there too. Being standardized, IQ is shown on a normal bell curve, with the majority of our population being to the center of the bell curve. Remember from Unit 1, the 68, 95, 99 rule, explaining standards of deviation? It's going to apply here. Individuals located to the right of the bell curve have an above average IQ, while individuals who are located on the left of the bell curve have a below average IQ. Now on to our last Unit 5 topic, language. So language is just going to be a way in which we communicate meaning to ourselves and other people. It can be spoken, it can be written, it can be gestured. As we mentioned in our Unit 2 section, in what feels like forever ago, for me at least, the two major brain areas to deal with our language are going to be Broca's and Wernicke's area. Broca right here, allowing us to speak. Wernicke somewhere over here, allowing you to understand speech. According to cognitive psychologist and linguist Noam Chomsky, every human is born with what he refers to as a language acquisition device, which is the part of the brain that allows us to learn language. Chomsky believed that language was the result of our biology, as his cross-cultural observations have shown that children from widely different cultures progress through the same stages of language development around the same age. Chomsky also observed that all human languages have the same grammatical building blocks, such as nouns, verbs, subjects, and objects. Benjamin Whorf theorized linguistic determinism, which is just the idea that language can affect our cognition and perception. According to Whorf, those who speak different languages oftentimes have different thought processes. There have been studies where a bilingual individual takes a similar intelligence test in two different languages, and their scores varied quite substantially. When it comes to intelligence testing, language barriers can actually serve as a bias. Several cross-cultural studies have shown the effect of social discrimination on intelligence test scores, as I mentioned earlier. In several societies, the average IQ of the majority group is generally higher than that of the minority group. If a standardized intelligence test reflects white middle-class cultural knowledge and values, minority group members might do poorly on it, not because of lower intelligence, but because of different cultural practices and norms. Alright, so that does it for Unit 5. Just bear with me because we only have 4 more units to go. Unit 6 is going to be Developmental Psychology. Developmental Psychology is the branch of psychology that studies how people change over the lifespan. Starting with physical development. At conception, chromosomes from both the mother and the father combine to form a single cell. This cell is known as a zygote. Known as the germinal period, the zygote is going to continue to go through cellular division until it attaches to the uterine wall, where after 2 weeks it's going to form to an embryo. From weeks 3 to 8, the baby starts to form organs and major body systems. Starting with the 3rd month, we have the fetal stage. This is where the embryo develops into a fetus. After a few months of fetal production, a baby is welcomed into the world. Aww. It is important to note that during pregnancy, specifically the embryonic period, babies are very prone to any harmful agent the mother might ingest. Whether it be alcohol, nicotine, or even Tylenol, teratogons refer to harmful agents or substances that can cause malformations or defects to an embryo or fetus. One of the most common teratogons, alcohol, can lead to a baby with fetal alcohol syndrome. Once born, development is only going to rapidly speed up, and psychologists love to observe these changes in development. So let's start by taking a look at motor development, as newborn babies come equipped with several reflexes in order to survive, such as the rooting and sucking reflex, which helps a baby with eating, keeping them nourished. Again, during this unit, I might be going a little out of order with the standards here just to make things run a bit more smoothly. So if you're following along with the standards, just make sure you're aware of that. So we're going to move on to social development, which is going to have a lot of theorists. Erik Erikson is going to be a stage theorist who came up with the psychosocial stages of development. Erikson's theory is an 8-stage theory that is going to focus on crisis resolution. At each stage of Erikson's theory, a social crisis must be resolved. If this crisis is not resolved, then the individual may lack the positive characteristics of that stage. In the 1930s, Konrad Lorenz observed what he called imprinting, which is when a newly born organism or animal comes to recognize another organism or animal as its parent, leading to the belief that attachment is a predisposed innate quality. Harry Harlow is also going to study the importance of attachment by observing baby monkeys, challenging a previous theory that attachment was based off of nourishment. In his research, Harlow observed that monkeys who develop healthy attachment through means of tactile comfort through touching and clinging fared much better than other monkeys in regard to emotional and social development. Another psychologist who tested attachment, Mary Ainsworth, identified 3 levels of attachment: secure attachment, insecure attachment, and avoidant attachment. According to Ainsworth, a child's attachment style is dependent on the behavior their mother shows towards them. Diana Baumrind studied the effect that parenting styles had on the development of children, observing 3 different forms: authoritative, authoritarian, and permissive. Psychologists generally come to agree that the authoritative form of parenting is the most effective. Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory way back in Unit 4 can also be used to help explain our social development. Bandura is going to emphasize the importance of observing, modeling, and imitating the behaviors, attitudes, and emotional reactions of others. Bandura believes that both environmental and cognitive factors play a role in our social development. On to our next developmental topic: cognitive development, with my buddy Jean Piaget. Piaget studied cognitive development specifically in young children and how they take in and process information. Piaget believed that young children were actively attempting to make sense of the world by constructing schemas, which we know are organized clusters of information. Piaget believes that we are actively assimilating and accommodating our schemas in order to take in new information about the world. Being a stage theorist, Piaget categorized his theory into 4 distinct stages. Starting at birth and lasting to about 2 years of age, we have the sensory motor stage. This is where development proceeds from reflexes to active use of sensory and motor skills to explore the environment. In this stage, the child acquires an understanding of object permanence and starts to understand cause and effect relationships. From ages 2 to 7, we have the pre-operational stage. Here is where development proceeds from understanding simple cause and effect relationships to pre-logical thought processes involving the use of imagination and symbols. During this stage, both thought and language are considered to be a little egocentric. Concrete operations last from ages 7 to 11, and we start to see development proceed from pre-logical thought to logical solutions to concrete problems. At this stage, reversibility is attained and the child has the ability to solve conservation problems. And our 4th and final stage of Piaget's theory, the formal operation stage, is going to begin in our adolescence and will last throughout our lifetime. In this stage, we see development change from logical solving of concrete problems to the logical solving of all classes of problems, including abstract and hypothetical ones. While groundbreaking, Piaget's theory does come with its fair share of criticisms. Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky believed that Piaget failed to address the impact of social and cultural factors on our cognitive development. Vygotsky theorized the zone of proximal development, which is just the difference between what we can learn on our own and what we can learn through the help of someone who is more competent, such as an adult, teacher, coach, me. Alright, next topic, moral development. In 1958, American psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg is going to hypothesize his theory of moral development, which is going to include 3 levels, each containing 2 stages each. The pre-conventional level, while not limited to, is generally seen in children up to the age of 10. Pre-conventional thinking is very egocentric, and people in this level base their moral decisions on how it will affect them. Someone might decide to steal money from someone because they know they can get away with it. If they don't think they'll get in trouble, they might not care. Alright, so next up we have the conventional stage. This is where our moral reasoning is going to be dictated by societal rules, laws, and expectations. A high schooler at a party might decide not to drink any alcohol because they know their parents would be disappointed in them if they did. And our 3rd and final level, a level that not every single person reaches, is going to be the post-conventional level of moral development. This is where moral decisions are based on abstract principles and values that are going to apply to all situations and societies. People on this level are going to seek to uphold principled agreements even if it's against the law. So we're going to have prominent individuals such as Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi. These guys are said to have represented post-conventional moral reasoning. Just like all other theories, Kohlberg had some criticisms as well. One big issue was the fact that his sample size for his study only included a bunch of young white men, not very diverse. One of his students, Carol Gilligan, actually had a big issue with his study and as a result went on to form her own set of moral reasoning that were designed specifically for women. While Kohlberg's approach was loosely based on Piaget's theory of cognitive development, Gilligan is going to focus more on the self and ego development. Her theory shares the same levels, so the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional, but the end goal of each level is going to be a little different. For females, according to Gilligan, the pre-conventional level includes egocentric self-care, where the goal is individual survival. Transitioning to the conventional stage, care becomes less selfish and more selfless. In this stage, care is generally focused on others while neglecting oneself. And in our third level of post-conventional thought, Gilligan states that this is when women learn to balance caring for oneself and caring for others. So a lot of theories we have went over in this unit focus on development in early years of life. While these years are crucial for our development does not just stop when we reach adulthood. During our adolescence, we go through that awkward stage of puberty, which represents sexual maturity and when someone becomes physiologically able to reproduce. During puberty, we also see the development of both primary and secondary sex characteristics. In our adolescence, we are in the stage of psychosocial development known as identity versus role confusion, where we attempt to form an integrated and stable self-identity. As we mature and have more adult responsibilities, we begin to form close, intimate, emotional bonds and eventually start families and have little babies. And believe it or not, research actually has shown that cognitive abilities and intelligence don't peak till around the age of 60, and even further research has shown that while our speed of processing may decrease, measures of knowledge remain stable in individuals up until 90 years old. Studies have also shown that aerobic activity and staying active is a proper formula for a happy, healthy brain. So get walking. Or as Ron Burgundy says it, get yogging. And for our final topic of discussion for developmental psychology, we have gender identity and sexual orientation. According to psychologists, gender is going to be the cultural, social, and psychological meanings that are going to be associated with masculinity or femininity. This is going to be different from sex, which refers to the biological category of male or female as defined by the physical differences in genetic composition. Gender identity is going to be one's own sense of being male or female. Oftentimes we see gender role stereotypes, whether it be blue for boys or pink for girls. Gender roles are considered sets of expected behaviors for males and for females. To explain this, we have the gender schema theory, which combines social learning theory with cognition and states that children will learn from their cultures a concept of what it means to be either male or female, and they will adjust their attitudes and behaviors accordingly. Whew! And there we have developmental psychology. Unit 7, motivation, motion, and personality. Here we come. Motivation is going to be any need or desire that energizes and directs our behavior. Research in motivation began as a result of Charles Darwin's study on evolution. These researchers would study human instincts, which are just going to be our complex behaviors that are with us from birth and are unlearned. While there are several core human instincts that explain behaviors, instincts did sort of start to become a fad in psychology, as one researcher compiled a list of over 5,000 supposed instincts from several different research publications. And not to mention, motivation is not only going to be a result of our instincts. Motivation is not only a result of our instincts, as we are pulled in and motivated by incentives as well. Incentives are just going to be positive or negative environmental stimuli that motivates our behavior, such as receiving a paycheck for a job or an A+ for doing good on a test. Achievement motivation refers to our desire for significant accomplishment and setting a high standard for ourselves. While achievement motivation serves no physiological purpose, it does help us with our psychological well-being. Motivation can also be intrinsic or extrinsic. Intrinsic motivators refer to our behavior that is driven by some type of internal reward. These are going to be anything that is naturally satisfying to us, so playing a sport or reading a book just because we like the story. On the flip-flop, extrinsic motivators are going to be behaviors that are driven by external rewards. These are things such as money, praise, or fame. When extrinsic rewards are given to intrinsic behaviors, it can actually lead to something known as the over-justification effect. This is where these external incentives actually decrease a person's intrinsic motivation to perform a task. For the AP Psych test, there are going to be several theories of motivation that you need to be aware of, and we're going to go over each one. The drive reduction theory is the idea that a physiological need creates an aroused tension state or a drive, and this drive will motivate us to satisfy this need in order to reduce it. The aim of reducing this drive is to maintain bodily balance or homeostasis. The arousal theory of motivation states that we are driven to perform actions in order to maintain an optimal level of physiological arousal. Everyone's level of optimal arousal is going to be a bit different. An important concept to understand in regards to the arousal theory will be the Yerkes-Dodson law, which basically states that at an optimal level of arousal, we are going to perform our tasks best, but if we have too little or too much, we might not perform as well. Humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow theorized that our goal-oriented behavior is a result of our attempt to reach our fullest potential or self-actualization. It is important to note that to reach the top of Maslow's hierarchy, each of the needs on the previous levels have to be met. The social psychology concept of cognitive dissonance can also apply to our goal-oriented behavior, as inconsistent thoughts or beliefs motivate us to change our behavior in order to make our thoughts consistent with one another. We'll see more about cognitive dissonance in Unit 9. An important fact to know about motivation is that it is not only referring to what motivates us to get out of bed or what motivates us to do our homework, but it is going to refer to all goal-oriented behavior, things such as eating and even reproducing. Hunger is going to come in the form of both physical motivation and psychological motivation. When our hypothalamus thinks it's time for a meal, it's going to send a message to our stomach to produce the main hunger hormone known as ghrelin. With this increased ghrelin count, our appetite increases as well, motivating us to eat. As I mentioned, psychological factors will also play a role in our motivation to eat. We as humans are not so different than Pavlov's dogs. Our mouths sometimes water when we're thinking of a nice juicy steak or a delicious cheesecake. The simple process of just thinking about food can raise our blood insulin levels, causing us to feel hungry. Culturally speaking, body image is a huge motivator in eating behavior. Unrealistic cultural standards of body image can lead to an increased prevalence of various eating disorders, such as anorexia and bulimia. Alright, so now for a quick, awkward 30-second conversation on sexual motivation. Alright, here we go. At the end of the day, sex is just a natural part of life. If this were not the case, none of us would be sitting here today. Much like eating, sexual motivation is a combination of both psychological and physiological motivators. Hormones released by the body in the form of testosterone for males and estrogen for females prime humans for reproductive purposes. External and imagined stimuli, as well as cultural norms, also play a role in one's sexual motivation. Biologist Alfred Kinsey even anonymously surveyed roughly 18,000 individuals from 1948 to 1953, asking about their sexual practices. While Kinsey even acknowledged the fact that his survey sample contained an overrepresentation of well-educated white individuals, his published work still became a bestseller. We as humans are also very social individuals, having upwards of 150 unique social relationships. Social motivation refers to the idea that we as humans are naturally motivated to form these social relationships as a means of survival. Alright, now on to our next topic of emotion. Emotions are going to be complex states that result in physical and psychological change that's going to influence our thoughts and behavior. An emotional response involves 3 stages: physiological arousal, expressive behaviors, and a conscious experience. Evolutionary psychologists believe that all human cultures share several primary emotions, being happiness, contempt, surprise, disgust, anger, fear, and sadness. All of our emotional responses are a result of the blending and different level of intensity of these primary emotions. There are going to be multiple theories on how we explain our emotional responses. The James Lange theory of emotion, proposed by one of our pioneers of psychology, William James, states that our experience of emotion is the result of a physiological response. Let's say you turn the corner of your house and you see a bear and you immediately begin to run away. According to the James Lange theory, the sight of the bear causes you to run, and then the running causes you to feel the emotion of fear. Psychologist Walter Cannon was not a fan of the James Lange theory, stating that different emotional responses share similar physiological responses. Things such as a racing heart can be present when we're experiencing both anger or fear, or even when we're surprised. Instead, according to Cannon, you see a bear, and this is going to simultaneously trigger both a physiological response of running and a fear response. The fear response coming from our brain's cortex, and the physiological response of running coming from our sympathetic nervous system. Today, most psychologists believe that our cognitions are also going to play a very important role in our emotional responses. Psychologist Stanley Schachter believes that to experience emotion, we must first experience some level of physiological arousal, then we assign a cognitive label to that arousal. Like James, Schachter believed that emotion grows from our body's awareness of arousal, but also believed, as Cannon did, that emotional responses are physiologically similar, meaning some form of conscious interpretation must occur. In 1991, psychologist Richard Lazarus proposed his cognitive appraisal theory. Lazarus stated that emotions are going to come from our appraisal or evaluation of events that cause different emotional reactions. Your psychology teacher tells you that there is going to be a pop quiz in 5 minutes. You appraise this event as non-threatening since you have been watching Get Psyched review videos and are confident in your ability to do well on the quiz. But your friend, being exposed to the same stressor, has not been watching Get Psyched review videos and instead of feeling confident starts to experience fear and anxiousness. In 2017, prominent neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux introduced a new theory explaining our emotions, stating that emotions are processed in our brain pathways differently, taking either a high road or a low road. The low road is considered a faster form of processing, where information travels directly from our sensory receptors to our amygdala, completely bypassing our rational thinking prefrontal cortex. Information on the high road goes from our sensory receptors to our prefrontal cortex and then to our amygdala. While the low road generally provides a quicker emotional response, it can lead us to think that a coiled hose on the lawn is a deadly snake, when in fact, it's just a hose. Psychologist Paul Ekman and his team went out to research cultural differences on our experiences of emotion. Their observations showed that while some gestures are culturally determined, facial expressions, specifically those relating to sadness and fear, are pretty common among all cultures. According to the facial feedback hypothesis, these universal facial expressions can actually amplify the expression of a specific emotion. Meaning when you smile, motor neurons in your face send a message to your brain that you were smiling, which in theory will cause that subjective feeling of happiness. How humans experience emotion is going to be fairly similar across the board, but researchers have observed that different cultures will have different beliefs in how emotions should be expressed. Known as display rules, cultures generally have informal norms about how to appropriately express our emotions. Tied in with emotions, we have stress. Stress is the process by which we perceive and respond to certain events that we call stressors. We appraise these stressors as either a threat or a challenge and act accordingly. We are going to see that prolonged exposure to stress can have both negative psychological and physiological effects. Psychologist Hans Selye theorized the three-phase human stress response known as the general adaptation syndrome. Phase 1 is going to be the alarm phase. This is where the stressor occurs and we experience a sympathetic nervous system response, increasing our heart rate and blood pressure in order to be prepared to face the perceived threat. During phase 2, the resistance phase, our blood pressure, temperature, and respiration are going to remain high, and hormones are flooding our bloodstream as our body defends itself against these stressors. If the stress persists, it can deplete our body's resources used to fight the stress, leading to phase 3, exhaustion, which is where stress-related illnesses can occur. High and persistent levels of stress are associated with decreased immunity, high blood pressure, headaches, heart disease, and can lead to the quicker progression of serious illnesses such as cancer. A huge cause of daily stress, conflict is going to be when we are torn between two opposing desires, motives, or goals. Individuals are going to be motivated to approach an outcome that is desirable to them as well as avoid any undesirable outcomes. Psychologist Kurt Lewin categorized 3 forms of conflict that we are going to go over. An approach conflict is one where you have to choose between 2 positive options. So let's say you get into your top 2 college choices and you are torn between which one to go to. While this is obviously great news, making the decision can still be very stressful. An avoidance conflict is a situation with 2 negative options that you have to choose between. Imagine you are stranded in the wilderness and you have to decide between eating some creepy bugs or starving yourself. Pretty extreme example, I know, but hey, first one came to mind. And on to our last form of conflict, the approach-avoidance conflict. Approach-avoidance conflicts are going to be when single goals have both desirable and undesirable aspects to them. Someone on a diet really wants a big piece of cake for dessert, and they are faced with the approach-avoidance conflict of sacrificing their diet just to satisfy their cravings. Approach-avoidance conflicts are going to be the most commonly experienced conflict, forcing us to decide whether to approach or avoid various outcomes. Now on to our final topic of Unit 7, personality. Personality is just going to be our unique and relatively consistent pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. As we talked about in our first unit, psychologists use a wide variety of research methods to answer their questions. Throughout the history of studying personality in psychology, we see the use of case studies, surveys, and personality inventories. There are several notable psychologists who have contributed to research in personality theory, and to start things off, we are going to dive into Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytical theory, as well as the contribution of various neo-Freudians. We are also going to talk about a few other theories of personality by taking a look at other theorists such as Maslow and Bandura's personality theory. The father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, goes and develops his theory on personality in 1923. Based on the extensive case studies he conducted on several of his patients. Freud believed that our consciousness was broken down into three levels: the conscious mind, the preconscious mind, and the unconscious mind. Our unconscious mind is going to hold all of our unacceptable urges, thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories that we are not consciously aware of. While we are not aware of these things, Freud stated that they play a huge role in the development of our personality. In Freud's theory, our personality is broken down into three personality constructs that guides and dictates much of our behavior and urges. At birth, the first construct of personality, the id, develops. Freud considered the id a reservoir of psychic energy that strives to satisfy our basic biological needs. The id is going to seek immediate gratification. Around the age of 4 or 5-ish, we start to develop our partly conscious, partly unconscious component of personality that is known as our superego. The superego develops as a result of our internalized ideals and provides standards for judgment. Superego goes and makes us feel fulfilled when we do something good, but then it also makes us feel guilty or bad when we do something we weren't supposed to do. And the last construct of personality is our ego, and it acts as the executive part of our personality, having to please both the demands of the id and the superego. The ego is going to operate on the reality principle, seeking to satisfy the needs of the id and the superego in more realistic ways. Freud believed that personality develops during the first few years of life, as most of his patients appeared to have symptoms that were rooted in unresolved childhood issues. According to Freud, children pass through 5 psychosexual stages of development during which the id's pleasure-seeking energies focus on a distinct bodily zone. When the ego fears it's losing the internal war with the id or the superego, it will often utilize something known as a defense mechanism to avoid any feeling of anxiety. A defense mechanism is going to reduce anxiety by distorting reality. The major defense mechanisms being repression, regression, reaction formation, projection, rationalization, and sublimation. While Freud's theories did receive a lot of criticism, mainly due to his heavy emphasis on aggressive and sexual behaviors, the basic premise behind psychoanalysis intrigued several psychologists. The neo-Freudians were influenced by Freud's basic ideas, specifically the id, ego, and superego, the importance of the unconscious mind, as well as childhood experiences. Alfred Adler and Karen Horney both agreed that childhood experiences are important detriments to personality development, but believed that childhood social tensions, rather than sexual ones, were the main driver of personality. So Adler is going to believe that psychological issues were brought by feelings of inferiority, while Horney theorized that childhood anxiety caused by the child's sense of helplessness triggers a desire for love and security. Carl Jung expanded the definition of the unconscious by theorizing our collective unconscious, which are concepts and beliefs shared by all people across cultures. Jung went as far as stating that the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution is born anew in the brain structure of every individual. Now, the psychoanalytical perspective is not the only one out there that attempts to explain how our personality develops. Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory is going to emphasize the importance of observational learning, conscious cognitive processes, social experiences, self-efficacy, and reciprocal determinism in determining personality development. Reciprocal determinism is a model proposed by Bandura that explains personality development as a result of the interaction of behavioral, cognitive, and environmental factors. Self-efficacy, according to Bandura, refers to the degree to which we are convinced of our own capabilities in meeting the demands of a particular situation. So do we think we can accomplish something, yes or no? So a high self-efficacy means we're confident in ourselves, while a low self-efficacy means not so much. Humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers believed that personality develops as a result of our actualizing tendency, which is just our innate drive to maintain and enhance our own personal growth. Rogers believed that children should experience unconditioned positive regard in order for the child's actualizing tendency to be fully expressed. Rogers' personality theory also includes the idea of self-concept, which is just our set of perceptions and beliefs that we hold about ourselves. Cultural values can also play a role into the development of a child's self-concept. especially in regards to collectivistic versus individualistic cultures. The last type of personality theory we are going to take a look at are going to be the trait theories of personality. One well-known trait theory is going to be the Costa and McCrae 5-factor personality model, which identifies 5 key traits of extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience as fundamental building blocks to our personality. Personality can also be measured through different types of personality tests or inventories. A personality test is going to be any questionnaire or standardized instrument designed to reveal some type of personality trait or characteristic. A projective test, such as the classic Rorschach ink blot test, involves a person interpreting various ambiguous images that are going to be used to assess unconscious motives, conflicts, or psychological defenses, as well as personality traits. Self-report inventories or objective tests have test takers respond to standardized questions that are compared to established norms. Self-report inventories are more commonly used today as they have a higher level of reliability and validity, which, as we know, is very important. Alright, so that wraps up our review on personality. Now on to our second to last unit of clinical psychology. We are almost finished. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders is a publication from the American Psychiatric Association and contains all the diagnosable mental disorders. The most current issue of the DSM is the DSM-5. Today, psychologists define a psychological disorder as a pattern of behavioral and psychological symptoms that cause significant personal distress, impair the ability to function in one or more area of life, or both. Oftentimes you might hear the word insane or insanity getting thrown around when discussing clinical psychology. It is very important to note that insanity is not a psychiatric diagnosis, but a legal term used in courts when someone is facing trial. When a defendant in a criminal case uses the insanity defense and pleads not guilty by reason of insanity, they are making the argument that they are not responsible for their actions due to an episodic or persistent psychiatric disease at the time of the crime. Statistics show that less than 1% of county court cases involve the insanity defense, and of that 1%, only 1 in 4 are successful. Now, a repeating theme in this course is our modern perspectives of psychology, and yes, psychologists from each approach have different views on what causes mental health issues. Psychologists who follow the biological or medical approach believe that the cause of psychological disorders are issues with physical structures in the brain and body, specifically related to the nervous and endocrine system. Psychoanalytical psychologists believe that abnormal behavior is the result of conflicts and repressions of the unconscious mind. Humanistic psychologists believe that the cause of mental disorder is the result of one failing to reach their own potential or for being out of touch with their own sense of self. The behavioral model focuses on how psychological disorders have learning as their basis, continual reinforcement of psychologically ill behaviors as well as environmental stimuli can lead to some psychological issues. Cognitive psychologists believe that the cause of mental illness is irrational thought processes that lead to our behavioral changes, and sociocultural psychologists analyze how social and cultural factors may contribute to a psychological disorder. An example being how cultural body standards can lead to development of certain eating disorders. No matter which area of expertise a clinical psychologist focuses on, they all follow the same diagnostic criteria provided by the DSM-5 when diagnosing mental illness. While the diagnostic labeling of mental illness has allowed for us to gain greater insight and understanding into maladaptive behaviors, there are still some negative aspects of diagnostic labeling pointed out in the Rosenhan experiment. In an attempt to determine the validity of psychiatric diagnosis, psychologist David Rosenhan and 7 other mentally healthy associates faked auditory hallucinations in order to be admitted into a psychiatric hospital. Their stays ranged from 7 to 52 days, and all but one was discharged with a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission. Rosenhan considered this to be evidence that mental illness is perceived as an irreversible condition. It is important to note that Rosenhan's experiment has come under a lot of criticism from the research community, stating that all the study really did was show us that it is possible to deceive doctors by lying about symptoms. The DSM-5 has over 20 categories of mental health disorders with more than 260 specific disorders. Luckily for us, we do not have to know each and every disorder for AP Psych, So we're just going to take a look at some of the more common ones that show up on the AP test. Starting with neurodevelopmental and schizophrenic spectrum disorders. Neurodevelopmental disorders are a group of conditions that generally manifest early in development and are characterized by developmental deficits that cause impairments in personal, social, and academic life. Some of the more prevalent neurodevelopmental disorders that we see are going to be ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. A neurocognitive disorder is going to be a general term used to describe a decrease in mental functioning that is going to be a result of a medical disease, not a psychiatric one. The most common cause of neurocognitive disorders in individuals over the age of 65 is Alzheimer's disease, when we start to see protein plaques and tangles on the brain cause cognitive decline. Considered one of the most severe of all the mental disorders, schizophrenia is characterized by an impaired ability to function as a result of severely distorted beliefs, perceptions, and thoughts. Symptoms of schizophrenia can be either positive, meaning an excess of distortion or normal functioning. These symptoms include things like delusions, hallucinations, or unorganized thoughts. Or symptoms can be negative, and this is when they reflect defects or deficits in normal functions. These are things such as flat affect, alogia, or abolition. Every year, about 200,000 cases of schizophrenia are diagnosed in the U.S., and annually there are approximately 1 million Americans who are being treated for schizophrenia. While there are several biological and environmental explanations for the illness, one of the more popular theories explaining the cause of schizophrenia is the dopamine hypothesis. The dopamine hypothesis states that high levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine appear to be associated with schizophrenia. And on to the next topic, bipolar, depressive, anxiety, and obsessive compulsive disorders. Bipolar disorder will be a disorder that is characterized by both depressive and manic episodes. Manic episodes include heightened energy and euphoria, and individuals who are experiencing manic episodes also experience an increase in self-confidence, feeling like they could take over the world. Reckless decisions can be made during manic episodes and generally require hospitalization. Bipolar disorder can be diagnosed as either bipolar 1 or bipolar 2. Those with bipolar 1 experience both manic and depressive episodes, while those with bipolar 2 experience a lesser form of mania known as hypomania that oftentimes does not require hospitalization. Depressive episodes are present in bipolar 2 as well. A related disorder, cyclothymic disorder, causes emotional highs and lows that are not as extreme as those with bipolar. With cyclothymia, those diagnosed experience short periods of mild depression and hypomania. Depressive disorders are characterized by a persistent feeling of sadness and worthlessness. Major depressive disorder or major depression, oftentimes referred to as the common cold of mental disorders, is one of the more commonly diagnosed mental health issues. Symptoms of major depression are not just emotional feelings of sadness, but also include behavioral symptoms, cognitive symptoms, and physical symptoms. It is also important to note that one of the major diagnostic criteria for the disorder is the length of the depressive episode, needing to last for more than 2 weeks to fit the diagnostic criteria. When depression is seasonal, it is diagnosed as seasonal affective disorder. With seasonal affective disorder, we generally see episodes of major depression occur at the start of the fall and continue into the winter months. Research has shown that the brain produces more serotonin when exposed to sunlight. In the winter months, there is less sun, leading to a majority of seasonal affective disorder cases occurring during these times. Some individuals will experience chronic forms of mild depression known as persistent depressive disorder, or PDD. While not as severe as major depression, these symptoms can be present for a very long time, with the possibility of lasting several years. Now on to anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders are categories of psychological disorders in which extreme anxiety is the main diagnostic feature. This extreme anxiety leads to disruptions in everyday life. Anxiety is just going to be an unpleasant emotional state that is going to be characterized by physiological arousal as well as feelings of tension and worry. Anxiety is a normal feeling that everyone experiences, but it can become an issue when it starts to interrupt with day-to-day functioning. Generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, is characterized by excessive and persistent symptoms of anxiety that result from a wide range of life events or circumstances, sometimes with little to no justification. When one source of anxiety is removed, it is replaced with another. GAD is going to be one of the more prevalent anxiety disorders. Panic disorder is going to be an anxiety disorder where a person experiences frequent and unexpected panic attacks. Panic attacks are going to be an extreme episode of anxiety that rapidly escalates. Oftentimes those with panic disorder fear leaving their houses because of the chances of having a panic attack in public, which is the diagnostic criteria for another disorder, agoraphobia. Phobias in general are going to be a persistent and irrational fear of a specific object, situation, or activity. To be considered a diagnosed phobia, the fear must cause issues in daily functioning. One of the more common phobias, social anxiety disorder, is characterized by extreme and irrational fear of being embarrassed or judged by others in social situations. Alright, now on to obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So in the DSM-4, OCD shared a category with anxiety disorders, but with the publication of the DSM-5 in 2013, it moved into its own category. Obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, is a mental disorder that is characterized by intrusive thoughts and repetitive behaviors or mental acts a person feels driven to perform. An obsession is a repeated, unwanted, and uncontrollable thought or mental image that causes extreme anxiety and distress. These are things such as contamination and pathological doubt. A compulsion refers to a repetitive behavior or act that a person feels driven to perform in order to reduce feelings of anxiety. Common compulsions seen in those with OCD include things such as washing, checking, and counting. There we have topic 8.4. Now on to our next set of disorders, trauma and stressor, dissociative and somatic symptom disorders. Just like OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, was categorized as an anxiety disorder in the DSM-4 and has since found a new home under trauma and stress-related disorders in the DSM-5. Known to previous generations as shell shock or battle fatigue, PTSD is a mental health disorder triggered by exposure to a highly traumatic event, resulting in recurrent intrusive memories of the event, avoidance of stimuli and memories associated with the event, negative changes in thoughts, moods, and emotions, and a persistent state of heightened physiological arousal. While many people commonly associate PTSD with soldiers returning from battle, it is important to note that PTSD symptoms can develop from other experiences, such as serious accidents, natural disaster, and other traumatic events. Alright, so next up we have our dissociative disorders. These disorders are characterized by disruptions in awareness, memory, and personal identity that impair the ability to function. Dissociative amnesia is going to be characterized by an inability to recall autobiographical information, such as an event or period of time. This is much more than just forgetting someone's name as soon as they tell you it. An example could be a crime victim who has no memory of being robbed, something you'd think someone would remember. Depending on its severity, dissociative amnesia can lead to an individual taking a new identity and life history in what is known as dissociative amnesia with fugue. Depersonalization and derealization symptoms include persistent or recurrent experiences of unreality or detachment from one's mind, or experiences of unreality or detachment from one's surroundings. Depersonalization symptoms have the individual feeling as if they are outside observers to their own self, while derealization symptoms have the individual feeling as if they are living in a dreamlike state. And for the most well-known dissociative disorder, dissociative identity disorder. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID, is characterized by the presence of two or more distinct personality states, or an experience of recurrent periods of amnesia. Way back in the 1980s when the DSM-3 was published, this disorder was known by a different name, multiple personality disorder. In 1994, with the publication of the DSM-4, the name was changed in order to reflect a better understanding of the disorder. And next for topic 8.5, we have our somatic symptom disorders. So somatic symptom disorders occur when an individual experiences one or more somatic symptoms that causes distress in daily life. These somatic symptoms lead to excessive thoughts or feelings regarding the symptoms. Conversion disorder is a condition where an individual experiences symptoms of altered voluntary motor or sensory function. Common symptoms of this disorder include paralysis of an arm or leg, loss of sensations in a body part, and even blindness. Yet, it can't be explained through physiological means. Illness anxiety disorder, formerly referred to as hypochondriasis, is a preoccupation with having or acquiring a serious mental illness. Physical symptoms of an illness are very mild or not even present at all, but the health concern triggers an alarming level of anxiety. Referred to as Munchausen's in the DSM-4, factitious disorder is when someone deceives others by appearing sick or by purposefully getting sick. Factitious disorder can also be imposed on other individuals, where an individual with the disorder falsely claims that another person has physical or psychological signs or symptoms of illness. And on to our last topic of disorders noted in the course and exam description, Eating, substance, and personality disorders. Starting with eating disorders, anorexia nervosa is a somatic condition characterized by a distorted body image with an unwarranted fear of being overweight. These fears lead to symptoms of trying to maintain a below normal weight through starvation or too much exercise. Bulimia nervosa is similar to anorexia regarding body image issues, but with different symptoms. Those suffering from bulimia generally maintain a normal body weight, but do so by forcefully purging food from their systems after they eat it. Binge eating disorder is a condition where the ability to regulate hunger is very low, generally as a result of an issue with the hypothalamus. Symptoms of binge eating can lead to excessive eating and an unhealthy weight gain. Next up, we have substance and addictive disorders. These disorders are characterized by physiological dependence of a particular substance, drug-seeking behavior, and experiences of withdrawal. To be considered a disorder, usage of the substance must cause disruption in day-to-day life. Commonly abused substances are things such as alcohol, cannabis, and various opiates. Next up, we have personality disorders. A personality disorder is a relatively consistent way of thinking, feeling, and behaving that deviates from the individual's cultural norms. There are a total of 10 diagnosable personality disorders that are categorized into 3 separate clusters. Cluster A is the odd eccentric cluster. It's going to include paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorder. The common feature for these disorders are social awkwardness and social withdrawal. Cluster B personality disorders are characterized by dramatic, overly emotional, or unpredictable ways of thinking or behaving. These disorders include borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. And cluster C personality disorders are going to be those that are characterized by anxious, fearful thinking or behaviors. Within cluster C, we have avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. I'm growing tired of saying personality disorder. So there we have our psychological disorders. Now on to how to treat these disorders. In the US, within recent years, mental health professionals have been focusing on preventative efforts in dealing with psychological disorders. The goal of these preventative efforts is to identify and treat mental health issues before the symptoms become too severe. As a result, the severity of symptoms and cost of providing treatment can be reduced. When taking a look at different treatment plans, we will be introduced to several prominent psychologists, some familiar and some new, that revolutionized various types of therapy. Psychotherapy is going to be the treatment of mental disorders by psychological rather than medical means. In following the behavioral approach, treatment plans center around the concepts of classical conditioning and operant conditioning, as well as other behavioral concepts. A student of behavioral psychologist John Watson, Mary Cover Jones, took the concept of classical conditioning and used it to remove a fear response. In what is known as counter conditioning, Jones would replace an unpleasant conditioned response with a pleasant one. A colleague and friend of Jones, Joseph Wolpe, expanded upon counter-conditioning and developed a treatment known as systematic desensitization, which attempts to replace feelings of anxiety with feelings of relaxation. The theory of operant conditioning proposed by B.F. Skinner can also be used in the treatment of mental disorders. Behavioral therapists use the principles behind shaping, reinforcement, and punishment to treat those with mental illness. Cognitive therapies involve treating mental illness by turning faulty, disordered thoughts into more realistic thoughts, which in turn can help change abnormal behavior and improve it. Psychologist Aaron Beck developed a form of cognitive therapy known as cognitive triad therapy, which involves attempting to get clients to engage in activities where they can be successful in order to relieve symptoms of depression. Beck noticed that clients, particularly those with depression, had a negative worldview, negative self-view, and negative view on the future. Beck believed that focusing on successful positive pursuits would help challenge the thought process and alleviate symptoms of depression. Sometimes psychologists take a treatment method from various approaches, and this can be seen with cognitive behavioral therapy, which, as its name implies, uses treatment from both the cognitive and the behavioral schools of psychology in order to treat mental illness. Psychologist Albert Ellis founded a specific type of cognitive behavior therapy known as rational emotive therapy, where a therapist attempts to have their client identify and confront their own irrational thoughts in order to change their behavior. The goal of humanistic therapy is to provide an atmosphere of acceptance, understanding, and sharing that permits the client's inner strengths and qualities to come to surface. Psychologist Carl Rogers proposed a form of humanistic therapy known as client-centered therapy, treating an individual as a client rather than a patient. Sessions are generally led by the client as the therapist shows unconditioned positive regard, genuineness, and empathetic understanding. Based on the working of Sigmund Freud, the goal of psychoanalytical therapy is to resolve past unconscious conflicts. Using methods such as free association or dream analysis, the therapist guides the client in gaining self-awareness and understanding of the influence of the past on their present behavior. Individuals who use any of the above methods of treatment for patients with mental illness are generally clinical psychologists. Clinical psychologists have their doctorate in the field of psychology and provide treatment for mental illness using psychotherapy techniques. Psychiatrists, on the other hand, are medical doctors who have a basic degree in medicine followed by a residency in psychiatry. While they can work in private practices, psychiatrists generally work in a hospital setting, and they also have the ability to prescribe psychotropic medications. Which brings us to the biological perspective's methods on treating mental illness. Biological psychologists believe that the cause of mental illness is some form of chemical imbalance in the brain, and this imbalance can be fixed and regulated through the use of medication. While psychiatrists do employ different psychotherapeutic techniques, their main source of therapy rests in psychotropic medications. The major forms of medication we are going to have are going to be anti-anxiety drugs, antidepressants, and antipsychotics. Each of these drugs will affect the production of a specific neurotransmitter in order to alleviate the symptoms of a specific mental illness. In severe cases where patients do not respond to medication, electroconvulsive therapy may be used, or in very rare instances, psychosurgery. For the AP test, it is important to understand the major differences of each treatment type, as therapists who follow each perspective have the main goal of alleviating a client's symptoms. They just take different paths in doing so. And my goodness, we are starting to see the light emerge at the end of this very long and dark tunnel, because we are now going to start our final unit, Unit 9, Social Psychology. Let's get started so we can get finished. Social psychology is going to be the scientific study of how we think about, influence, and relate to one another. Social psychologists are going to study the various social influences that help explain why people act in certain ways in social situations. We are going to start off social psychology with attribution theory and person perception. When explaining others' behaviors, we tend to credit it to either the situation or the person's own disposition. In social psychology, this is known as attribution theory. When we analyze another's behavior, we oftentimes have the tendency to underestimate the situational or environmental factors while overemphasizing the personal dispositions. Now, when you see someone leave class early to go home, you think it's because they're lazy and they just don't want to be there, but when you have to leave class early to go home, it's because you have other more important things to do. A self-serving bias is our tendency to attribute our successful outcomes to internal causes and our unsuccessful outcomes to external, situational causes. So if we do good on a test, it's because we're smart, but if we do bad on a test, it's because we didn't have enough time to study. And one of my personal favorites, you never told us that was going to be on the test. The false consensus effect is when we see our own behavioral choices or judgments as common to the rest of the general population. If my favorite fast food is Taco Bell, then I might overestimate the number of others who also share that belief. Apparently it's not many. Who would have known? It's delicious. Cheesy gordita crunch, are you kidding me? The just world phenomenon, used to explain why society often blames the victim when faced with misfortune, states that people have the tendency to believe the world is just and that people get what they deserve. And the halo effect is a bias we experience when we make an overall judgment on something based off of one trait it exhibits. People oftentimes view celebrities as attractive or successful and also tend to see them as intelligent and kind as well, which when you meet them may not always be the truth. Our self-concept is going to be our set of perceptions and beliefs that we hold about ourselves. We are going to see that there are several factors that influence our own self-concept, which also affects how we perceive others. Social psychologists study a wide variety of factors such as gender, race, and ethnicity when studying self-concepts. The self-fulfilling prophecy is a process where a false expectation we have leads to this expectation becoming true. So you're thinking there's no way you're going to pass the upcoming test because you are not smart enough. So this initial thought results in a behavioral change of you not trying to study as hard as you would have. What does this result in? You getting a poor grade on the test, confirming the original belief that you're not smart enough. So your own negative expectations in this scenario and lack of studying is what led to the poor grade, not your actual level of intelligence. And now on to our next topic, 9.2, attitude formation and attitude change. Attitude is going to be defined as a learned tendency to evaluate an object, person, or issue in a certain way. There is a bunch of psychological research out there explaining our attitude and why it changes. In 1957, psychologist Leon Festinger proposed his theory of cognitive dissonance, which is just an unpleasant state of psychological tension that we experience when two or more of our thoughts are inconsistent with one another. This uncomfortable feeling generally occurs because we become aware of these conflicting thoughts. In order to resolve this dissonance, we can either change the existing belief, add new beliefs, or reduce the importance of the beliefs. Another way our attitude can be influenced is through persuasion. Persuasion is an attempt to influence the attitudes or behaviors of others. The elaboration likelihood model suggests that our attitudes can change through evaluation of the content of persuasive messages or by irrelevant persuasion. The elaboration likelihood model is going to include the central route to persuasion and the peripheral route to persuasion. Alright, so next up, topic 9.3, conformity, compliance, and obedience. In 1951, psychologist Solomon Asch set out to investigate the extent to which social pressure from a majority group could affect an individual to conform to the group. Conformity is going to be the act of adjusting our opinions, judgments, or behaviors so that they match the opinions, judgments, or behaviors of the group. During his experiment, Asch would show an image like this one. As you can see, you have one line to the left and a group of 3 other lines to the right. Participants were tasked with matching the line on the left to the one of 3 lines on the right. There were a total of 8 participants who would announce their response aloud to the group. However, there was a twist to the experiment. 7 of the quote-unquote participants were actually in on it and were purposefully giving the wrong response, just to see what the individual being tested would do. Would they conform? Yes or no? Well, Asch found that 76% of participants conformed with the group judgment on at least one of the clinical trials. And when all the data was combined, it was shown that the test participants conformed and gave the wrong answer on 37% of the clinical trials. Asch concluded that the individuals he tested conformed to the group because of both normative social influences and informational social influences. Obedience is going to be how our behavior is altered or influenced as a result of a direct command, typically brought upon by an authority figure or someone of higher status. In 1963, psychological researcher Stanley Milgram conducted his experiment on obedience to authority figures. Influenced by the terrible acts seen in World War II, Milgram wanted to see how far people would go obeying instruction if it involved harming another person just because an authority figure says to do so. Participants in the study believed they were taking part in a learning experiment where wrong answers were punished with an electric shock that increased with each incorrect response. The experiment involved the experimenter, who was an individual in a white lab coat running the experiment, and the teacher and learner. The learner was in on the experiment while the teacher was the participant. The results of Milgram's study showed that 65% of participants continued to the highest level of volts, absolutely stunning both Milgram and other researchers in the social psych community. Another prominent and well-known study in psychology dealing with obedience to authority is going to be the Stanford Prison Experiment. Conducted in 1971 by Dr. Philip Zimbardo, the major goals of the study were to measure the effect of role-playing, labeling, and social expectations on behavior. Zimbardo set up a makeshift prison at Stanford University and recruited 18 students who were randomly assigned as a guard or a prisoner. As soon as the experiment started, the guards began to conform to their social role and act in ways that were aggressive and abusive towards the prisoners, while several of the prisoners began to experience severe negative emotions. Throughout the experiment, the prisoners obeyed the orders of the guards, even though they were told they were free to leave at any time. I won't go into too much detail here, but it is important to note that the Stanford Prison Experiment faces tons of criticisms by psychologists today. Unlike obedience, where a person is in a position of authority, compliance is going to be when our behavior changes due to the request or direction of another person. Reciprocity is a social norm we follow where we respond to a positive action with another positive action. When we feel like somebody is going out of their way to help us, we often feel like we should do the same. Think of a situation where some charitable organization is handing out pamphlets. They hand you one with a little gift keychain and you listen to what they have to say. Later on, they ask you if you mind donating to their cause, and you feel the need to do so because of the initial gift they gave you. Alright, topic 9.4, group influence on behavior and mental processes. A social group is going to be two or more people who interact with one another, accept expectations and obligations as members, and also share a common identity. Members of social groups generally follow agreed upon social norms, which are just going to be an understood rule for accepted and expected behaviors. There are going to be a lot of theories and concepts that predict the impact of the presence of others on individual behavior, and in an attempt not to make this video any longer than it already will be, I am going to be going through these fairly quickly, so be ready. Social facilitation is when our performance is improved when we are in the presence of others. Think of professional athletes. Chances are they perform much better at games with thousands of fans cheering them on rather than at practice. On the reverse, social inhibition is when we perform tasks more poorly or slower in the presence of others. This is usually because we have not mastered or just not an expert on whatever we're doing, and we're a little bit nervous about messing up in front of other people. Social loafing, often seen in individualistic cultures, is the tendency for people in a group to do less work when working together toward attaining a common goal. While social striving is when there is an enhanced work ethic while working in a group. De-individuation occurs when a person loses self-awareness and self-restraint while in a group situation that fosters arousal or anonymity. Anonymity. We'll go with anonymity. De-individuation can be used to explain occurrences such as cyberbullying, mobs, and riots. Group polarization is the enhancement of a group's attitude through discussion within a group. The more and more a group talks about their shared beliefs, the more they are reinforced. This echo chamber mentality can lead to groupthink, where there is a desire to maintain peace and harmony within a group, causing people not to disagree with one another in situations where they might want to, which can hinder group progress. A social trap is any situation where a group of people act to obtain short-term individual gains, which leads to a long-run loss for the group as a whole. When it's really hot outside, you might think it's a good idea to blast your air condition, something you do for yourself to stay comfortable. But imagine every single person decides to blast their AC all at the same time, and it leads to a power outage. Now we all have to go through the rest of the day with no AC. The reciprocity norm states that we repay in kind what another has done for us. For you Office fans out there, just think about Season 6, Episode 9 of The Office, where Andy and Dwight keep doing favors for one another just because they feel like they owe it to the other person. The bystander effect is the tendency for any given bystander to be less likely to give aid if other people are present. This can be explained through something called the diffusion of responsibility, which states that a person is less likely to take responsibility for action or inaction when other people are present. And we are very, very close to the finish line now because we are moving on to topic 9.5, bias, prejudice, and discrimination. We are going to discuss this topic by taking a look at Muzafer and Carolyn Sheriff's Robbers Cave experiment, which took place in 1954 with the goal of creating conflict and hostility between two groups and then employing intervention strategies designed to reduce the tension and hostility. Researchers randomly selected and assigned 22 11 and 12-year-old boys of similar backgrounds into one or two groups, the Eagles or the Rattlers. After groups were formed, the psychologists, who were posing as camp counselors, purposely put the two groups in situations that would put them against one another, such as sporting events and other general camp competitions. In-groups refer to the groups that we are members of, while out-groups refer to the groups that we are not members of. Pretty obvious. In the Robbers Cave experiment, tension quickly rose between the two groups. Prejudice or unjustified negative attitudes for others were easily observed between the two groups. These prejudice attitudes led to acts of discrimination by both groups, getting into fights and messing with each other's personal belongings. Stereotypes, which are generalized beliefs about groups of people, also started to arise between the Eagles and the Rattlers. There are several explanations psychologists give on the cause of conflict. The scapegoat theory states that prejudice provides an outlet for anger. When bad things are going on, people often want answers and they want someone to blame. Not that it's right, but scapegoating provides a target for anger and frustration. Ethnocentrism is the belief that one's own culture or ethnic group is superior to others. It also includes using one's own culture as a standard by which to judge others. And last, we have outgroup homogeneity, which is just the tendency to see members of outgroups as very similar to one another. So how do psychologists believe that we can increase cooperation? In the Robbers Cave experiment, tensions were reduced between the Eagles and the Rattlers through teamwork-driven tasks that required intergroup cooperation for success. According to contact theory, intergroup contact under appropriate conditions can effectively reduce prejudice between majority and minority group members. Just like that part in Remember the Titans where Coach takes the boys out to Gettysburg. We are also going to see that subordinate goals, which are shared goals that override differences among people and require cooperation, also help in relieving tensions amongst groups experiencing conflict. Alright, 2 more to go. Topic 9.6, altruism and aggression. Altruism is when we help another person with no expectation of personal reward or benefit. A simple example could be you just lending your classmate a pencil because they forgot theirs at home. Aggression, on the other hand, refers to verbal or physical behavior that is intended to cause harm to other people. An example is when your classmate asks you for a pencil for the 50th time in 1 week. There are 2 types of aggression we're going to talk about. Instrumental aggression is aggressive behavior intended to achieve a goal, such as 2 UFC fighters going at it to try and win the championship, while hostile aggression is committed in response to a perceived threat or insult. Big example of hostile aggression would be road rage. And finally, our final topic for this course, topic 9.7, interpersonal attraction. Attraction between people leads to the development of both platonic and romantic relationships. So not only being attracted to a potential significant other, but also what qualities attract you in a friend. And we also have the mere exposure effect that states that we develop preferences for things just because we are familiar with them. Stimuli we are more exposed to in our everyday lives, we are more comfortable with. Oh my goodness, and we are done with the AP Psychology exam cram. Remember, this video should not be your only source of information going into the AP Psych test. The point of this video was to give you a quick run through of all the course content so you can see what stuff you might want to revisit before taking the AP test. Well, at least I intended it to be quick. I have plenty of other videos on the channel, including unit review videos as well as shorter concept review videos that you can check out to give you a little bit more of an in-depth explanation to some of the course material. If you did enjoy this video, please do feel free to like and subscribe. It is always appreciated and will keep you posted on when I post new videos. I wish each and every one of you the best of luck on your AP Psych test this year. Until next time,